I raised 4 children alone after their mother left us, worked 3 jobs so they could become doctors and lawyers, sold everything I owned to pay for their weddings and homes. Then a winter storm hit, and I called each one begging for shelter because my heat died and I'm 79 years old. All 4 said no. I ended up on the streets while they lived in mansions I helped buy. But 3 years later, they wished they'd answered my calls. But you won't believe what happened next. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time is it there right now, and please subscribe so more people hear this story. I worked in factories for 37 years, doing double shifts and weekend overtime because my wife walked out when the kids were small and never came back. Raised all 4 of them completely alone from the time the youngest was 3 years old. Made their lunches every morning at 5 before my shift started. Helped with homework every night, even when I was so tired I could barely see straight. Never missed a single parent-teacher conference or school play, even when I had to leave work early and lose pay, because I wanted them to know their father cared about every part of their lives. Saved every extra dollar I made by skipping meals and wearing the same 3 outfits for years so I could put money away for their futures. When college time came, I took out massive loans that I'm still paying off at 82 years old because I wanted all 4 of them to get degrees and have professional careers I never had the chance to pursue. Paid $40,000 for my oldest son's medical school, $35,000 for my daughter's law degree, funded the other 2 through business school and engineering programs by working night security jobs on top of my factory work. When they got engaged, I sold my car that I needed to get to work and started taking 3 buses each way so I could pay for their wedding ceremonies because I wanted them to have beautiful days they'd remember forever. Gave my daughter $18,000 for her dream wedding. Gave each son $15,000 for theirs, walked them down aisles knowing I'd be taking buses in winter storms for years to pay off what I'd borrowed. When they wanted to buy houses, I emptied my entire retirement account that I'd been building for 23 years and split it between all 4 of them for down payments because I thought helping my children succeed was more important than my own comfort in old age. Handed over $67,000 total while keeping nothing for myself, moved into a cheaper apartment in a bad neighborhood so they could move into nice suburbs with good schools for the grandchildren I rarely got to see. Worked until I was 76 years old with arthritis so bad I could barely grip tools and a back injury from lifting heavy machinery for decades because I still had debts from giving them everything. Never complained once, never asked them to pay me back. Never made them feel guilty because I believed that's what fathers do when they love their children more than they love themselves. Bought my grandchildren birthday presents with money I should have spent on my own medication. Showed up to their school events even though my children seemed annoyed I was there in my worn-out clothes. Gave them my whole life, my health, my future, every dollar I ever earned. And I did it gladly because I thought family meant something, that sacrifice would be remembered. That love given unconditionally would be returned when I needed it most. Watched all 4 of my children become incredibly successful in their careers, and I should have felt nothing but pride seeing them achieve everything I worked so hard to give them. My oldest son became a top surgeon at a major hospital making $500,000 a year. My daughter became a partner at a corporate law firm driving a Mercedes and living in a house with 6 bedrooms. My 2 younger sons both became wealthy executives with corner offices and vacation homes, one running a tech company and the other managing investments for millionaires. They lived in massive houses in gated communities where security guards checked identification at the entrance, drove luxury cars that cost more than I made in 5 years of factory work, sent their kids to private schools that charged $30,000 per year just for kindergarten. Took vacations to Europe and the Caribbean multiple times annually, posted photos on social media of themselves on yachts and at fancy restaurants where a single meal cost what I spent on groceries for a month. But somewhere along the way, as their bank accounts grew and their social circles became filled with other wealthy people, I became something they were ashamed of instead of proud of. Started noticing how they stopped inviting me to family gatherings and holiday dinners. How I'd only hear about celebrations after they already happened when I'd see photos posted online of everyone together except me. When I did get invited to something, they'd tell me to come early or late so I wouldn't be there when their important friends arrived. My daughter once picked me up for her son's birthday party and made me change clothes in her garage before coming inside because my jacket was too worn and she didn't want her neighbors seeing me walk up to her house looking poor. My oldest son introduced me to his colleagues at a hospital fundraiser as, "This is my father," with no pride in his voice, just embarrassment, like he was ashamed that his successful surgeon career came from a man with calloused hands and cheap shoes. They started making excuses for why I couldn't come to their homes, saying they were renovating or having work done. But I'd drive by and see their houses were fine and full of people who weren't me. Stopped returning my calls for days or weeks, would text me back instead of talking because hearing my voice reminded them where they came from. My grandchildren barely knew who I was because their parents kept me away like I was something dirty that might ruin their perfect lives. Realized my worn-out clothes and my old age and my poverty had become their greatest embarrassment now that they had money and status and friends who'd never struggled for anything. The foundation I built for their success with my sweat and my sacrifice and my empty bank account was something they wanted to hide instead of honor. They wanted everyone to think they'd made it on their own, that they came from wealth and privilege, not from a poor factory worker who gave up everything so they could have chances he never got. I became invisible to them, just an old man who reminded them of struggles they wanted to forget, and they pushed me further and further away until I barely existed in their lives anymore. 3 years ago in January, the weather report started warning about a massive winter storm coming that would be the worst our city had seen in decades, with temperatures dropping to -15 degrees and heavy snow that would knock out power across entire neighborhoods. I was living in a tiny one-bedroom apartment in the poorest part of town where the heating system was old and broken half the time, where the landlord never fixed anything and the walls were so thin I could feel cold air coming through the cracks. The building was falling apart with pipes that froze every winter and electricity that went out whenever the weather got bad. When I heard the storm was coming, I felt real fear because I was 79 years old with a bad heart and lungs that couldn't handle extreme cold. Knew I wouldn't survive if my heat went out in those temperatures. Started calling my children 2 days before the storm hit. Called my oldest son first and asked if I could please stay at his house for just a few days until the dangerous weather passed. He told me he was too busy with work, and his guest rooms were full of storage, and he couldn't possibly make space on such short notice. Called my daughter next, explained I was scared about the storm and my apartment wasn't safe, asked if I could sleep on her couch for 3 or 4 nights maximum. She said her husband had important clients coming over and they couldn't have guests in the house right now. Told me to try a hotel if I was really that worried. Called my 2 younger sons and got the same responses. One said his wife was sick and couldn't handle having anyone else in the house. The other said they were about to leave town and wouldn't be home anyway. Begged each of them, told them I was genuinely afraid I might die if I stayed in my apartment during this storm, reminded them I was almost 80 years old and not strong enough to handle extreme cold anymore. All 4 of them gave me excuses about busy schedules and no extra room and bad timing, like I was asking for some huge favor instead of asking my own children to keep me from freezing to death. Hung up the phone after the last call and sat in my cold apartment knowing my 4 successful children who lived in houses with 6 bedrooms and heated garages had all decided I wasn't worth the minor inconvenience of letting me stay for a few days. The storm hit that night exactly as predicted. Temperatures dropped so fast I could see my breath inside my apartment within 2 hours. My heating system made terrible noises and then stopped working completely around midnight. Then I heard pipes bursting in the walls and freezing water started flooding my bathroom and kitchen. Building lost all power by 2 in the morning and the cold became unbearable. So intense I couldn't stop shaking even wrapped in every blanket I owned. By dawn, the building inspector came and condemned the whole place as unsafe, said everyone had to evacuate immediately because the damage was too severe and the structure might collapse. Found myself at 79 years old standing outside in -degree weather in the middle of a blizzard with 1 small bag of belongings, everything I owned either destroyed by burst pipes or left behind in a condemned building. Started calling my children again, left messages begging them to please answer and come get me because I had nowhere to go and I was freezing. None of them answered their phones. Not one of my 4 children picked up when their father called them in the middle of a dangerous storm, needing help desperately. Stood there in the freezing rain and snow for hours trying to reach them, watching other families from my building get picked up by their relatives while I stood alone with a dead phone battery and nowhere to go. That was the night I realized my children had collectively decided their poor, embarrassing father wasn't their problem anymore, and they were willing to let me freeze to death rather than disrupt their comfortable lives for even one night. Spent the next 3 years living on the streets because I had no money for rent after losing everything in that storm and no family willing to take me in even temporarily. Started sleeping at homeless shelters when they had space available, which wasn't often because shelters were always full and they gave priority to younger people or families with children. Most nights I slept on park benches or under highway overpasses or in doorways of closed businesses, trying to find spots where police wouldn't force me to move along. Winter was absolute torture for an old man with health problems. Spent countless nights shivering so violently I thought my bones would break. Wrapped in newspapers and cardboard, trying to keep warm enough to survive until morning. Summer wasn't much better because the heat made me dizzy and sick, couldn't find water fountains that worked, and sometimes went days barely drinking anything. My body started falling apart faster, lost 30 pounds because I was only eating what I could get from soup kitchens or dig out of restaurant dumpsters. Begged for money outside grocery stores and restaurants, held a sign that said I was a homeless veteran, even though I wasn't a veteran, because people gave more money when they thought you served the country. Watched people who looked exactly like my children walk past me every single day, wealthy men and women in expensive suits who wouldn't make eye contact and pretended I didn't exist. Sometimes I'd see someone who reminded me of one of my kids, and I'd call out to them before realizing it wasn't them, just another rich person who saw homeless elderly people as invisible obstacles on the sidewalk. My children knew I was out there somewhere living on the streets because other family members had told them, cousins and old friends who'd seen me begging and called my kids asking why they weren't helping their father. But none of them came looking for me. None of them drove through the areas where homeless people gathered to see if I was okay. They just collectively decided that their poor father who'd given them everything was too much of a burden and too much of an embarrassment for their perfect wealthy lives. Got beaten up twice by younger homeless men who wanted the few dollars I'd collected that day. Spent 4 days in a hospital with broken ribs and nobody came to visit me because the hospital couldn't reach my emergency contacts who refused to answer calls from unknown numbers. Developed pneumonia 3 separate times from sleeping in the cold and rain, each time barely survived because I was too old and weak to fight off serious illness without proper medicine or rest. Other homeless people became my only community. We'd share food and blankets and watch out for each other because we understood we were all society had given up on. An old woman named Ruth, who slept near the library, would save half her soup kitchen meal for me on days when I couldn't walk far enough to get food. A man named Carl, who'd lost everything in a factory accident, would let me share his spot under the bridge on the coldest nights. These strangers with nothing showed me more kindness and humanity than my own children who had everything I'd given them. They didn't care that I smelled bad or looked terrible or had no money. They just saw another human being who deserved basic dignity and compassion. Meanwhile, my 4 kids were living in their mansions and driving their luxury cars and taking their expensive vacations, probably telling their friends their father had died years ago so they wouldn't have to explain why they'd abandoned an elderly parent to die slowly on the streets. Became completely invisible to regular society, just another nameless old beggar that people stepped around without thinking about. Lost all my identification documents and my social security card in those 3 years, lost my sense of self-worth and my will to keep fighting. Started thinking maybe I should just lie down somewhere cold and not wake up because this couldn't be what my life was supposed to become after everything I'd sacrificed and everyone I'd loved. 1 year into living homeless on the streets, I ran into a distant cousin I hadn't seen in decades who recognized me begging outside a coffee shop and stopped to talk. She looked horrified seeing me in that condition and told me something that made my blood run cold. Said she'd gone to my daughter's house 6 months earlier for a family funeral, and everyone there told her I had died 2 years ago. Asked her what she meant, and she explained that all 4 of my children were telling everyone I was dead, that I'd disappeared, and they'd held a small private memorial service. Didn't understand how that was possible since I was clearly alive standing right in front of her, so she helped me go to the county records office to check if anything had been filed. Discovered my children had legally declared me dead through the courts, filed paperwork claiming I had disappeared without a trace, and was presumed deceased after being missing for over a year. They'd gotten a judge to sign off on a death certificate, even though they'd never searched for me, never filed a missing person report, never did anything except decide I was too inconvenient to exist anymore. Found out they did this specifically so they could claim my life insurance policy that I'd kept paying on for 40 years, even when I could barely afford food, because I wanted to leave them something after I died. The policy was worth $47,000, and they'd split it 4 ways, each of them taking almost $12,000 while I was sleeping under bridges at 80 years old. They'd also used the death certificate to close my bank accounts and take the $800 I had left, to stop paying the small amount of child support debt they owed me from loans I'd given them, to erase every legal obligation they had to support their elderly father. While I was begging for food outside restaurants and getting beaten up by other homeless people for spare change, my 4 children were meeting with lawyers to have me erased from existence so they could inherit what little I had left. While I was nearly dying from pneumonia in a hospital hallway, they were signing legal documents swearing I was dead and splitting up money that was supposed to pay for my funeral someday. They committed actual fraud, lied to courts and insurance companies, falsified documents, all so they could get their hands on $47,000 that meant nothing to them but would have gotten me off the streets. The cruelty of it broke something in me that hadn't broken even through 3 years of homelessness and starvation. My own children didn't just abandon me, they legally killed me on paper so they wouldn't have to feel guilty anymore about leaving me to die. They could tell their friends and colleagues that their father had passed away, could accept condolences and sympathy, could pretend they were grieving instead of admitting they'd thrown away their elderly parent like garbage. They threw away the man who'd raised them alone and paid for everything they ever had, declared him dead for pocket change they didn't need, and never lost a single night of sleep over it. Every time they spent $1 of that insurance money on restaurants or vacations or luxury items, they were spending money they'd stolen by killing their father on paper while he starved in real life. Realized in that moment that my children weren't just cruel or selfish, they were genuinely evil people who'd looked at their sick elderly father who'd given them everything and decided he was worth more dead than alive. They'd calculated that $12,000 each was worth more than whatever remained of my life. They'd chosen money over the man who'd sacrificed 40 years so they could have the comfortable lives they were living. Stood there in the county records office at 81 years old, holding a copy of my own death certificate with my children's signatures on it, and felt rage replace the sadness I'd been carrying. They'd made a terrible mistake declaring me dead, because dead men can't fight back, but I was still breathing, and now I knew exactly what they'd done, and I was going to make them pay for every single crime they'd committed against me. 6 months after discovering what my children had done, I was sleeping in a doorway outside a law office building downtown during a cold November rain when I started coughing so hard I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they were filled with concrete, and my chest hurt so badly I thought I was having a heart attack. Collapsed right there on the concrete at 82 years old, unable to move or call for help. A young lawyer named Marcus Chen was leaving his office late that night and found me lying there barely conscious, immediately called an ambulance, even though I begged him not to because I couldn't afford hospital bills. He rode with me in the ambulance and stayed at the hospital for 6 hours while doctors treated me for severe pneumonia and dehydration, never left even though he didn't know me and had no reason to care about a homeless old man. When I woke up the next morning, he was sitting in a chair next to my bed with coffee and breakfast he'd bought from the hospital cafeteria. Started asking me questions about my life and how I ended up on the streets. Genuinely wanted to know my story instead of just judging me like most people did. Told him everything over the next 3 days while I recovered in that hospital bed, explained how I'd raised 4 children alone and paid for their entire lives, how they'd refused to help me during the storm and I'd ended up homeless. Showed him the old photos I kept in a plastic bag of my kids graduating college and getting married, pictures from when they still loved me, or at least pretended to. His face got darker and angrier as I talked, especially when I told him about discovering they'd declared me legally dead to steal my insurance money while I was living on the streets. Marcus pulled out his laptop right there in the hospital room and started looking up my children online, found their fancy law firm websites and hospital profiles and corporate executive pages with photos of them smiling in expensive clothes. Asked me if I had any proof of what they'd done, and I showed him the death certificate copy I'd been carrying, showed him the insurance payout records the county clerk had given me. He stared at those documents for a long time before looking at me with an expression I'll never forget, pure righteous fury on behalf of someone he'd just met. Said to me in a voice shaking with anger that what my children did wasn't just cruel. It was multiple serious crimes including elder abuse and insurance fraud and identity fraud and embezzlement. Explained that declaring a living person dead to collect their insurance is a felony that could send someone to prison, that abandoning an elderly parent in dangerous conditions is criminal neglect, that they'd broken so many laws he couldn't believe they'd been stupid enough to document everything officially. Told me he was going to take my case completely free because what happened to me was so evil he couldn't sleep at night knowing those people were walking around unpunished. Said he specialized in elder abuse law and he'd seen terrible things but never anything as calculated and heartless as 4 wealthy adults declaring their elderly father dead for pocket change. Promised me he would make them pay for every single thing they'd done, that he'd use every legal weapon available to destroy their comfortable lives the way they'd destroyed mine. Spent the next 2 weeks after I got out of the hospital meeting with Marcus almost daily while he built the case against my children, going through old bank records and loan documents proving how much money I'd given them over the years. He worked like a man possessed, staying up all night researching laws and preparing legal filings, telling me this case would define his career because everyone would know he was the lawyer who brought down 4 rich criminals who'd tried to kill their father. Marcus looked at me during one of our meetings and said something I'll never forget. Told me that my children made one fatal mistake when they declared me dead instead of just ignoring me. Said that by making it official and committing documentable fraud, they'd given us everything we needed to destroy them completely in court and in public, and we were going to make sure the whole world knew what kind of monsters they really were. Marcus filed lawsuits against all 4 of my children simultaneously on the same day. Coordinated it so they'd each get served with papers at their workplaces in front of their colleagues and clients. My oldest son got served while he was doing rounds at the hospital with medical students following him. My daughter got served during a meeting with her law firm partners. My 2 younger sons got served at their executive offices in front of their employees. Each lawsuit was thick as a phone book detailing every crime they'd committed, every dollar they'd stolen, every lie they'd told. Charged them with criminal elder abuse for abandoning me during the storm knowing I could die. Charged them with fraud for falsely declaring me dead. Charged them with embezzlement for stealing my life insurance payout and my bank accounts. Charged them with conspiracy because they'd all worked together to commit these crimes. Added civil claims for emotional distress and punitive damages. Demanded they pay back every dollar I'd ever given them with 40 years of interest calculated, demanded additional millions in punishment for their cruelty. Marcus subpoenaed all their bank records going back a decade and found the insurance money deposits, found emails between them discussing how to handle the father situation, found text messages where they complained about me being an embarrassment to their social status. Discovered my daughter had told her husband in an email that declaring me dead was the cleanest solution to stop me from asking them for help. Found records showing my oldest son had Googled, "How long until missing person presumed dead?" 2 months before they filed the paperwork. The evidence was so damning that Marcus called a press conference before the trial even started, invited every news outlet in the city to hear about 4 wealthy professionals who'd declared their homeless father dead to steal his insurance. Gave reporters copies of my death certificate with their signatures, copies of the insurance payouts, photos of me living on the streets during the time they claimed I was dead. The story exploded across local news that same night with headlines like, "Wealthy children declared poor father dead while he lived homeless," and 4 professionals accused of elder abuse and fraud against own father. My children's faces were plastered on every news channel and newspaper. Their names and workplaces published for everyone to see, their crimes described in detail that made them sound like the worst kind of monsters. The story went viral on social media with thousands of people commenting about how disgusting they were, how they deserved to rot in prison, how anyone who could do that to their own father didn't deserve to breathe. Their phones started ringing constantly with reporters asking for comments. Their employers got flooded with complaints demanding they be fired immediately. My daughter's law firm put her on immediate leave pending investigation because they couldn't have a lawyer who'd committed fraud representing clients. My oldest son's hospital started an ethics investigation because the medical board received hundreds of complaints about his moral character. My younger son's companies issued statements distancing themselves from their executives' personal lives. Everything fell apart for them within 72 hours of the lawsuits being filed. Marcus kept feeding new information to the press every few days to keep the story alive. Released the emails where they called me an embarrassment. Released their tax returns showing they'd claimed me as a dependent for benefits while I was homeless. Released photos of their mansions next to photos of me begging on streets. Public outrage grew so intense that protesters showed up outside my daughter's house with signs calling her evil, showed up at my son's hospital demanding he lose his medical license. Their lawyers tried to settle quietly, offered me money to make the case go away before trial, but Marcus advised me to refuse because we had them completely trapped, and going to trial would destroy them even more thoroughly. Told the press I was rejecting their settlement offers because my children needed to face public trial and full legal consequences, needed everyone to see exactly what they'd done in open court. The judge denied their requests to seal the case records or close the courtroom, said the public had a right to see justice served in such an egregious case of elder abuse and fraud. My oldest son, Richard, lost his medical license 3 months before the trial even started, after the state medical board completed their investigation into his moral character and found him unfit to practice medicine. The board's report stated that any doctor who would abandon his elderly father to die homeless and then commit fraud to steal from him showed such profound lack of ethics that patients could not trust him with their lives. His hospital terminated his employment immediately, and every other hospital in the state refused to hire him because the board's findings were public record that any employer could see. Watched him go from making $500,000 a year as a respected surgeon to working at a pharmacy counting pills for $15 an hour because that was the only medical job he could get without a license. His wife filed for divorce 2 months later because she couldn't handle the shame and didn't want to lose her social standing by staying married to him, took their house and half his assets in the settlement. His own children stopped talking to him after kids at their private school bullied them about having a father who'd abused his grandfather. My daughter Jennifer lost her partnership at her law firm within a week of the story breaking because the firm couldn't survive the public relations nightmare of employing a lawyer who'd committed the exact kind of fraud she was supposed to help clients avoid. Every client she'd been representing requested different attorneys because they couldn't trust someone who'd defraud her own father. The State Bar Association opened an investigation into whether she should be disbarred completely for moral turpitude and conduct unbecoming an attorney. She ended up losing her law license 6 months later after the bar found she'd violated multiple ethics rules by participating in fraud and elder abuse. Went from being a partner making $400,000 annually to being unemployable in any legal capacity, couldn't even work as a paralegal because no firm would hire a disbarred attorney. Her husband left her because his family business couldn't be associated with someone involved in such a public scandal. Took their kids and got full custody because the judge didn't think she had appropriate moral character to raise children. My 2 younger sons, Michael and David, both lost their executive positions when their companies decided the negative publicity was affecting business too severely. Michael's tech company fired him after clients started canceling contracts, saying they couldn't work with a business that employed someone who'd commit elder abuse, lost his $200,000 salary, and his stock options that would have been worth millions. David's investment firm terminated him after wealthy clients threatened to pull their money if he remained employed there, said they couldn't trust financial advice from someone who'd steal insurance money from his dying father. Both of them lost custody of their children in brutal court battles, where family court judges reviewed all the evidence from my case and determined that men who would abandon their elderly father and commit fraud against him posed a risk to their own children. The judge's rulings specifically stated that if they couldn't be trusted to care for their own parent in desperate need, they couldn't be trusted with the welfare of minors. Their ex-wives got full custody, and they were restricted to supervised visitation only. All four of them became unemployable in their professional fields because background checks showed their criminal elder abuse cases and fraud charges, because simple internet searches of their names brought up hundreds of news articles about what they'd done. They'd spent decades building prestigious careers and reputations that I'd funded with my life savings, and watched it all disappear in months because their cruelty had finally been exposed to the world. Their friends abandoned them because nobody wanted to be associated with people who'd done something so universally despised as abusing and defrauding an elderly parent. Their extended family members stopped inviting them to gatherings and cut off contact completely. They became social pariahs in their own communities, had to move out of their nice neighborhoods because neighbors treated them with such hostility. Everything they'd built on the foundation of my sacrifices crumbled to dust, and they had nobody to blame but themselves for being stupid enough to document their crimes and evil enough to commit them in the first place. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the courtroom was packed every single day with reporters and people from the public who'd followed the story and wanted to see my children face justice in person. Marcus presented mountains of evidence that my children couldn't dispute. Bank records showing the insurance deposits, the death certificate with their signatures, emails and text messages planning how to declare me dead, testimonies from shelter workers who'd seen me during the years I was supposedly deceased. My children's lawyers tried every defense they could think of, but nothing worked because the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The worst moment for them was when Marcus made each of them take the witness stand and admit under oath exactly what they'd done, made them explain to a courtroom full of people why they'd refused to let their elderly father stay with them during a dangerous storm. My oldest son stammered through an explanation about being too busy with work, sounded pathetic trying to justify leaving his father to freeze. My daughter tried to claim she didn't know I'd become homeless, but Marcus showed phone records proving family members had called her multiple times telling her I was on the streets. Marcus put me on the stand and had me describe in detail what my life was like during those 3 years of homelessness, while my children sat at their table refusing to make eye contact with me. Described sleeping in freezing temperatures wondering if I'd wake up. Described begging for food outside restaurants. Described getting beaten and robbed. Described nearly dying from pneumonia 3 times. Described finding out my own children had declared me dead and stolen my insurance money while I was still breathing and suffering on the streets they'd forced me onto. The jury looked at my children with such disgust and hatred that I could see several jurors wiping away tears of anger while I testified. When Marcus showed them photos of me from my homeless years next to photos of my children's mansions and luxury cars, 2 jurors actually gasped out loud. When he presented evidence of how much money I'd given them over the years compared to the $47,000 they'd stolen, the entire jury shook their heads in disbelief that anyone could be that ungrateful and cruel. The judge's words during sentencing will echo in my mind forever. She looked at my 4 children sitting in that courtroom wearing expensive suits I'd paid for through my decades of sacrifice and spoke with a fury I'd never heard from a judge before. Said they'd stood in her courtroom dressed in success their father had funded, while he'd stood outside in rags they'd forced him into through their abandonment and neglect. Said they'd declared him legally dead to steal his insurance while he begged strangers for food to survive another day. Ordered them to pay restitution of $2.3 million combined, calculated every single dollar I'd spent on their educations and weddings, and house down payments over 4 decades, and added interest and inflation adjustments. Added another $1 million in punitive damages for the intentional cruelty and fraud they'd committed, said the amount needed to be devastating enough to punish them appropriately for such evil actions. Ordered the payments immediately with their assets to be seized and sold if they couldn't pay within 90 days. My children's lawyers filed appeals within hours, but every appeals court denied them, said the evidence was too clear and the restitution was appropriate given the severity of their crimes and the documented harm they'd caused. Watched as courts ordered their homes sold at auction, their cars repossessed, their bank accounts emptied, their investment portfolios liquidated. Everything they owned that I'd helped them buy got taken away to pay me back for what they'd stolen and destroyed. The judge also ordered permanent restraining orders, preventing them from contacting me ever again unless I initiated contact first. Said I deserved protection from the people who'd tried to erase me from existence. Made it part of the court record that they were convicted elder abusers whose crimes would follow them forever, show up on every background check, prevent them from ever working in their professional fields again. Their perfect lives built on my sacrifice were officially destroyed by legal order, and there was nothing they could do to stop it or fix it or escape the consequences of their own evil choices. I live now in a comfortable 3-bedroom house that Marcus helped me buy with the settlement money in a quiet neighborhood where people actually say hello and treat me like a human being worth knowing. Have heat that works perfectly, a soft bed I never take for granted, a kitchen stocked with food I don't have to beg for or dig out of dumpsters. Wake up every morning warm and safe, and still can't quite believe this is real after 3 years of sleeping on frozen concrete, wondering if I'd survive another night. Marcus became more than just my lawyer. He's like the son I thought I had but never actually did. Visits me twice a week to check on me and make sure I'm doing okay. Helped me reconnect with the people from the shelter who'd shown me kindness when I had nothing. Invited them to my house for meals, and helped several of them find housing and jobs with the connections he had. Ruth, who'd shared her soup kitchen food with me, lives in my guest room now because she's too old to be on the streets, and Carl, who let me share his bridge spot, comes over every Sunday for dinner. These people who society threw away became my real family, the kind that doesn't measure your worth by your bank account or your social status, or whether you're an embarrassment to be seen with. They knew me at my absolute lowest and still treated me with more dignity and compassion than my own children ever did after they got successful. We sit around my table sharing meals and laughing about surviving things that should have killed us, grateful we found each other when the world had decided we didn't matter. My 4 children are all completely destroyed now in every way that matters, financially ruined with their assets seized and sold to pay me the millions the court ordered. Richard works at that pharmacy, barely making enough to pay rent on a studio apartment, walks to work because he can't afford a car. Jennifer couldn't find any legal work and ended up taking a job as a secretary making $30,000 a year, lost her nice house and lives in a tiny apartment in a bad neighborhood. Michael and David both work random jobs they're overqualified for because nobody will hire them for anything professional, struggling to pay child support and supervised visitation costs. All 4 of them are socially destroyed with their reputations permanently ruined, can't go anywhere without people recognizing them from the news coverage and treating them with disgust. Their names are forever linked to elder abuse and fraud in every internet search, every background check, every conversation where someone asks about their past. They're legally branded as criminals and abusers in public court records that will exist forever, can never escape what they did, or rebuild the lives they destroyed through their own cruelty. They send me letters every few months begging for forgiveness, writing long explanations about how sorry they are and how they've changed, and asking if we can reconcile. I return every single letter unopened because there's nothing they could say that would make me forget they left me to die in a storm at 79 years old because I was poor and embarrassing to their rich friends. Nothing they could write would erase them declaring me legally dead to steal $47,000 while I begged for food on streets. No apology exists that could make up for 3 years of homelessness while they lived in luxury I'd paid for. Sometimes I drive past their old neighborhoods where they used to live in mansions, see the houses they lost being lived in by new families, and feel satisfaction knowing karma didn't just punish them, but completely destroyed everything they built on my broken back. They wanted me dead and gone so they could forget where they came from. But instead, they're the ones who got erased, while I'm finally living the peaceful, comfortable life I earned through 40 years of sacrifice they tried to steal from me. Sit on my porch every evening watching the sunset with Ruth and Carl and Marcus, surrounded by people who value kindness over money and loyalty over status. And I know I won. My children thought declaring me dead would let them move on and forget about their poor, embarrassing father, but all it did was give me the evidence I needed to destroy them completely while the whole world watched, and I sleep soundly every night knowing they got exactly what they deserved for trying to kill their father for pocket change.